My name is Darren Charles and I represent the Folk Horror Revival Group. I was honoured to be returning to Edinburgh for this year's festival, after speaking in 2018 with my colleague Andy Pachorek. But circumstances, alas, have robbed us of that lovely meeting of like-minded folk. Not to worry, we shall unite over the internet instead, hopefully bringing even more people together in a virtual environment. Anyway, my talk is a brief history of the witch in cinema. I hope you enjoy it. A stereotypical image of the witch has changed dramatically since the birth of cinema. The evil old hag with a large warty nose and pointy black hat, zipping about on a broomstick, has fallen by the wayside in recent years, to be replaced by a far more contemporary image. The contemporary screen witch does not have a particular look, gender, age, nor do they hail from a specific social group. They can be the girl or boy next door, the elderly person down the street, or the parent on the school run. There really is no fixed image. Once upon a time, they were often thought of in a negative light, the villain in a myriad of folklore and fairy tales. However, since those days, we've seen the reappraisal and rebirth of the screen witch, with many positive role models working for the benefit of others. This talk will take us through the last 120 years or so of cinema, taking in key social changes that have taken effect along the way. As already discussed, there is a negative stereotype of the witch as an evil old hag with a crooked warty nose and a black pointy hat. The image dates back into history and is drawn from a variety of different sources. The first group of sources are the medieval and early modern court records that are responsible for introducing us to certain figures we've come to know well over the years. Infamous witch hunters Matthew Hopkins and John Stern, those they accused, such as the one-legged Elizabeth Clark or the Minister of Brandeston, John Lowes, the Pendle witches, and Isabel Gowdy from Aldern in the Highlands of Scotland. The second group is literature. This dates back at least as far as Shakespeare's classic play Macbeth, which features an iconic trio of witches, but potentially even further. There are other plays from that era, like John Marston's Tragedy of Sophonisba, Thomas Middleton's The Witch, and Rowley, Dekker and Ford's The Witch of Edmonton. These reflect a variety of different beliefs and practices, from classical practices in a world of Romano-Carthaginian conflict to literary or academic witchcraft knowledge, and topical events drawn from the witchcraft pamphlets of the day in rural England. The third category includes the aforementioned witchcraft pamphlets that describe the various cases that arose in Britain in the 16th and 17th century, alongside the demonologies that also became popular in the early modern period. Most notably, Sprenger and Kramer's Malleus Maleficarum, a 15th century witch-hunting handbook that also went under the name of Witch's Hammer, and the King James Demonology, written down in 1597 by the then Scottish king, in response to allegations that he had been subjected to attacks by a group of witches from North Berwick. The final category is art. There's a wealth of wonderful woodcuts from the early modern period featuring various depictions, from pointy-hatted witches flying on broomsticks accompanied by the devil, to others showing images of them feasting with demons with their familiars, or with the imps that they are alleged to have fed and looked after for their lord and master. The work of artists like Francesco Goya and Henry Fuseli also add to this stereotypical image of the witch by presenting her as both elderly and ugly. The first occult revival took place in the late Victorian age, and was led by an interest in fortune-telling, spiritualism, and esoteric theory and practice. Thomas Waters, in Cursed Britain, quoted the Eastern Evening News from the 17th of March 1894. The belief in witches and witchcraft is as strong as when the notorious Hopkins drove such a roaring trade as a witch-finder. Imps are still dreaded, the cauldron of the weird sisters still bubbles. This is the world that the new medium of film was born into, and most importantly for us at the dawning of this new era in entertainment, is the visionary work of the prolific French filmmaker Georges Méliès, who often drew influence from the fields of fantasy, magic and the occult. Méliès was the first filmmaker to feature supernatural elements on screen when he shot The Haunted Castle in 1896. However, it was 1903's The Enchanted Well that first shows an image of the witch on screen as an old, crooked-looking woman, albeit briefly. However, it was the 1906 film La Fille Garabossa, aka The Witch, that gives us our first prolonged image of the witch on screen. She follows the traditional stereotype of a crooked elderly female with a bent nose and a pointy black hat. In the film, a troubadour visits a witch seeking his fortune. In exchange, he promises her a big bag of gold, but tricks her by paying her in sand. Upon realising she's been duped, the witch exacts her revenge on him. The character of the witch is very striking here, and I think it's fair to suggest she can be seen as an influence on the image of the Wicked Witch of the West, from the classic Wizard of Oz. In 1922, however, we get a fictionalised feature-length documentary film about witchcraft, demons and all things diabolical. Benjamin Christensen's Häxan Witchcraft Through the Ages is a Swedish-Danish production, dramatising various scenarios inspired by the demonologies and witchcraft pamphlets discussed earlier. And while the film is a fairly forward-thinking piece, looking at how superstition, disease and mental illness could be mistaken for signs of witchcraft, it presents some quite revelatory imagery for the time. Most notably are the scenes of a witch's sabbat that show the witches engaging in acts of debauchery with demonic figures and the devil himself. This sequence is also the first to show the osculum infame, or obscene kiss, where witches kiss the devils behind. Most of this ties in with the accounts of Isabel Gowdy, the Scottish witch from Alden, whose confessions remain some of the most remarkable documents of the early modern period. Isabel offered a fully detailed accounts of her attendances at sabbats and the feasting and fornication that takes place between the witches, the devil and the demons, which is vividly brought to life by Christensen. In keeping with the general perceptions of the time, the witches in Häxan are often depicted as elderly, crooked women. This also fits with Georges Méliès's earlier portrayal. The 1920s and 30s largely ignored the witch. However, by the late 1930s, Hollywood had begun to catch the witchcraft bug. Walt Disney's first feature-length cartoon, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, from 1937, features the first true Hollywood witch. All cheekbones and grand costumes, the evil queen is dripping in Hollywood ostentatiousness. A couple of years later, in 1939, the iconic Wicked Witch of the West makes her screen debut in The Wizard of Oz. Harking back to Georges Méliès's earlier depiction of the witch, although with her green face she adds another facet to the stereotype that would proliferate through the years, especially in children's TV and films. How many episodes of Scooby-Doo feature green-faced witches? In the excellent Waking the Witch, Pam Grossman discusses the connotations associated with the colour green and how it manages to evoke images related to envy, poison and plague. It's also worth noting that whilst The Wizard of Oz is a key factor in the proliferation of the negative stereotype of the witch, it is also worth considering that in Glinda we're introduced to a beautiful, generous and above all good witch, disproving the idea that all depictions of the witch at this time fitted the negative stereotype. It's also worth noting that L. Frank Baum, who wrote the original novel in 1900, was a theosophist who, inspired by his mother-in-law, the abolitionist Matilda Jocelyn Gage, joined the group in 1892. In the 1942 romantic comedy I Married a Witch, starring Veronica Lake, the witch, Jennifer, returns from the dead alongside her father to wreak havoc on the descendants of the Salem residents who were responsible for their deaths. She ends up falling in love with one of them. I Married a Witch is notable for a couple of reasons. It was the first time a witch was introduced into a modern urban setting on film. And secondly, she's seeking vengeance for crimes committed against her. And perhaps most significantly, she's not an elderly woman with a warty nose, but a beautiful young woman. Ultimately, what I Married a Witch does is to open the door for the next wave of witchcraft-inspired TV and film. It is also worth noting that around this time, experimental filmmaker Maya Darren was creating short avant-garde films featuring occult references and imagery. Darren's work helps to open the doorway for the likes of Kenneth Anger, who shall be discussed later. As the 1950s arrive, we see the next step in the development of the image of the witch. Spellbook and Candle was released in 1958 to great success. Drawing heavily on the same formula as I Married a Witch, it starred Kim Novak as Gillian, a free-spirited witch who, assisted by her familiar, a Siamese cat named Pyewacket, casts a spell on her neighbour, ensuring that he falls head over heels in love with her. Worried that he will discover her secret and want nothing to do with her, she begins to realise the consequences of her actions. While Spellbook and Candle continues to take the witch into a cosy middle American setting of domestic bliss, it is also a reminder that with magic comes responsibility. The rise of the feminist movement in the 1960s was highly significant for the makers of the TV sitcom Bewitched, which began broadcasting in 1964. The series starred Elizabeth Montgomery as Samantha, a beautiful young witch who's also a typical American housewife, and in later series a mother to her daughter Tabitha. At this time, most women were portrayed on screen as subservient housewives. However, here we have a strong female character who was every inch a match for her husband. Whilst this is a massive stride forward at the time, Samantha was still tied to a role of suburban domesticity. In the same year, Mary Poppins floated onto our screens. Based on the popular literary tales by P.L. Travers of a mysterious nanny who literally blows into the lives of those in need of her specific brand of guidance. Poppins is never outed as a witch, but she fits the role perfectly. Whether jumping into chalk paintings or taking the children in her care on a variety of magical adventures, she weaves a spell on all those around her. Set in the early 20th century against a backdrop of women's suffrage in a society dominated by patriarchal figures, Poppins stands out as a formidable female figure, who regularly puts the men around her in her place. Most notably the children's father, Mr. Banks, or Dick Van Dyke in one of his many roles. She's also a role model to the other women. Her very presence allows Mrs. Banks to invest more time in the suffrage movement, which was of course a key part of the drive to break gender stereotyping. There is, however, a dark side always bubbling beneath the surface with Mary. Whatever happens to all the nannies that blow away at the beginning of the film, I guess we'll never know. Another interesting slice of trivia is that Travers herself was a follower of Gurdjieff, and a good friend of both William Butler Yeats and A.E., George William Russell. So it's not a huge stretch to imagine she may well have had a reasonable amount of knowledge relating to witchcraft and magic. Another TV series that began in the same year of 1964 was The Addams Family. While Samantha tried to fit within the societal norms of the time, Morticia, the Addams matriarch, is anything but normal. She oozes sex appeal. Ty Gooden describes her as the archetypal goth girl. The Addams Family provides an interesting take on the modern family. Morticia's husband Gomez worships her. He sees her as his equal in every single way. He encourages her endeavours, respects her opinion, and compliments her on her intellect as well as her beauty. They work together to raise their children in a way that was quite forward-thinking for the time, as most children in the period were reared by women alone. It's also worth mentioning that Morticia and her family have continued to thrill viewers ever since in a host of films and even an animated series. Alongside Vampira, Morticia proved to be the inspiration for a host of other strong females on TV and in film. Most notably, the horror host Elvira. As we can see, there was a positive shift in the way witches were being portrayed on screen. They were now beautiful women, with their own ideas and their own agency. They were filling the traditional role of homemaker still. However, they seemed to have greater say in things, and whilst we still had a long way to go, it was a step in the right direction. As the 1950s gave way to the 60s, a trio of films, Night of the Demon, Horror Hotel and Mask of Satan, fostered an interest in witchcraft and magic within the horror genre. Night of the Demon is particularly interesting for its depiction of occultist Julian Carswell, a character loosely based on Aleister Crowley. A host of films followed in their wake. Night of the Eagle, Eye of the Devil and Curse of the Crimson Altar were just a few of the films to feature occult themes in the new decade. The rise of the counterculture during this time saw an interest forming in alternative spirituality. This led to a rise in interest in witchcraft of both the traditional and the modern type that had grown in popularity in the years since the repeal of the Witchcraft Act in 1951. This had allowed people like Gerald Gardner and Doreen Valiente to begin to write openly about their own experiences with the craft for the first time. And as more counterculture types became interested in Eastern mysticism, many others were just as fascinated by something just as interesting and esoteric from a little closer to home. Along with Gardner and Valiente, the works of Aleister Crowley, Eliphas Levi, A.E. Waite, Helena Blavatsky, J.R.R. Tolkien, Lewis Carroll, Margaret Murray and Christina Hall had begun to take hold of the imagination of the young, and this mix of magic, folklore and fantasy would prove enormously creative in the later years of the 1960s and early 70s. Films like Hammer's 1966 classic The Witches and the same year's Italian exploitation flick The Witch in Love found an audience with this new switched-on youth. 3 really important films were released towards the end of the decade. The first I'm going to discuss is Rosemary's Baby from 1968. Roman Polanski's classic centres around a young, recently married couple, Guy and Rosemary, who fortuitously find an apartment in the Bamford building, after which they begin to find things falling into place for them. Guy lands a leading role in a major play, and Rosemary falls pregnant. After several unusual incidents, Rosemary begins to suspect that the elderly couple next door may have something to do with them. There are a number of hints throughout that Roman and Minnie Castevet are practicing occultists. The pendant given to Rosemary for good luck is but one example of their beliefs seeping through into the film's narrative. What is so interesting is the way in which Roman and Minnie are portrayed on screen. A cheery, friendly old couple who just so happen to be satanic witches. This is the first time that Satanism was represented on screen with a friendly, sympathetic face that scared the pants off viewers. Rosemary's Baby, along with The Exorcist, remains a classic of the genre and the catalyst for a host of devil, children and possession films that appeared in the 1970s. The other 2 films that were incredibly important at the time were both based on documented cases of witchcraft trials from the 16th and 17th centuries. Michael Reeves' classic Witchfinder General from 1968 and Otto Kavavra's Witch Hammer from 1970. Witchfinder General draws on the story of Matthew Hopkins, a young man from Manningtree, Essex, who in the 1640s set himself up in southeast England as the Witchfinder General of the title. Hopkins and his assistant John Stern accused over 200 people of witchcraft, approximately 100 of whom were executed as witches. Whilst Reeves' film plays up the violence and the characters of Hopkins and Stern for the screen, his portrayal relies on facts for a lot of its narrative. Although his depiction of a woman being burned at the stake was incorrect for England, where victims were always hanged, A lot of what he shows, including the swimming of the accused, has a basis in fact. The swimming of witches involved ducking the accused in a river or lake, and if they floated, they were guilty and executed. But if they sank, they were found not guilty, but usually drowned anyway. Reef's film also relates to the work of historians Keith Thomas and Alan McFarlane, who at the beginning of the 1970s were taking a new approach to the historical study of the witchcraft trials by looking at it from an anthropological perspective. Both men found that most witchcraft accusations came, for the most part, not from the elites, but from local squabbles within the accused's own community. This is evident in Witchfinder General. Vavra takes a similar approach to Reeves. However, he sticks more closely to the facts of the cases he bases his film on. Witchhammer is probably the most accurate screen adaptation of the witch trials. It eschews playing up the violence in favour of developing an understanding of the trial process. And much like Ken Russell's The Devils, the film centres on a man of cloth, Dean Lautner, who becomes accused of witchcraft, or heresy in the case of Russell's film. Despite the fact Vavra's film sticks much closer to the facts, it does feature some horrific scenes of torture. One particular scene that made a huge impact on me features a woman being pricked with a pin. However, it's a fake designed to ensure that no blood flows from the accused. This sort of deception was evident throughout the period. A good example comes from the Newcastle witch trials of 1650, when a lady was allegedly found guilty, only for a gentleman present at the time to insist the pricking be done again. On the second attempt she bled, and the accusation was thrown out. The 1960s ended with the death of the hippie dream, as the events of Altamont, Vietnam and the Manson murders showed. Things had turned pretty sour, and even the music of the time had a harder edge to it. Bands like Black Sabbath, Uriah Heep and Black Widow replaced the peace and love bands with a much darker musical focus. Despite this, interest in witchcraft continued to grow. The early 70s saw the rise in popularity of a new phenomenon, the Witchcraft Documentary. For the first time, witchcraft was being talked about on screen by those involved. Alex and Maxine Sanders appeared in Legend of the Witch and Secret Rites, both of which are available on Blu-ray from the BFI, as well as The Power of the Witch, in which they appeared alongside Doreen Valiente and historian Keith Thomas. And even Anton LaVey managed to get himself on screen in the slightly earlier Witchcraft 70. Alongside a host of lurid paperbacks about witchcraft and magic from the time, many of these documentaries are quite sensationalist or exploitative in their approach, thus the spawning of the term witchsploitation. They're also an important record of the era, and still exude a strange power today. How many musicians have borrowed images or sound bites from those films for their performances? How many writers still obsess over them? One film that may well have been influenced by some of the witchcraft documentaries is Simon, King of the Witches. For the first time on screen, we're introduced to a male witch, Simon, who just so happens to live in an LA storm drain. Crammed with ritual imagery, Simon, King of the Witches is also the first film of its kind to show the importance of the connection between the witch and the natural world. In the modern era, many witches are keen environmentalists, and green issues are generally of great importance to all within the witchcraft community. Finally, I think it's also important to touch upon something else Simon brings to the table for discussion. In one scene, after performing a ritual, Simon tells his friend Hercules that the two of them will have to share the responsibility of their actions. Taking responsibility for what you put out there into the world is an integral factor in witchcraft. In many instances, people talk about the power of three, where whatever you put out into the world returns to you, only magnified 3 times. George A. Romero's Season of the Witch, named after the Donovan song of the same name, depicts witchcraft as a means to escape the drudgery of a miserable existence. Jean is the bored housewife of a violent and controlling husband, Jack. After visits to a psychologist fail to help, Jean decides to visit a tarot reader. This event symbolically represents the opening of a doorway to a world of magic, and when Jack leaves on a business trip, Jean buys a book about witchcraft and starts taking control of her own life. She casts a spell on her daughter's sometime lover, Grey, in order to make him attracted to her, a move designed to empower Jean and diminish her feelings of loneliness. As Jean becomes more involved with the craft, she begins to experience harrowing nightmares, which result in her shooting her husband dead when he arrives home early from his trip. Once Jean is absolved of the murder, she's pictured at the film's climax receiving her induction into a coven. This leaves things somewhat open to interpretation. Was the shooting of Jack really an accident, or did her empowerment lead to her removing him from her life permanently? The film could also be deemed a warning about using magic responsibly. Jean buys the book and, without any prior training or knowledge, starts to perform spells. This highlights one of the potential dangers associated with witchcraft, that of jumping into the practice of magic without any experience or suitable knowledge. The early 1970s was a particularly fruitful time for the supernatural on film. As well as those already discussed, Alejandro Jodorowsky's El Topo and Holy Mountain are both worthy of mention for their engagement with the spiritual and the supernatural, while Piers Haggard's Blood on Satan's Claw and Jaromil Jireh's beautiful tale of dark folklore, Valerie and her Week of Wonders, both touch upon magic and witchcraft. It's worth noting that Valerie was a huge influence on Angela Carter's own dark fairy tales, so much so that it was a key influence on her decision to write them at all. By far the most renowned of all the films of this era was The Wicker Man, the story of a pagan community living on the island of Summerisle. After their previous year's harvest failed, they instill measures to ensure that this year's harvest would be a fruitful one. Christopher Lee takes the role of Lord Summerisle, the head of the community, with Edward Woodward as the police sergeant sent to the island as an outsider to investigate the disappearance of a local girl. The film draws inspiration from a lot of genuine folklore and customs from around the UK. Ideas about encouraging prosperity and a successful harvest through ritual and tradition is central to The Wicker Man, but also relates back to many of our own cultures and traditions. The film's success lies in its close relationship to reality. In 1973, William Friedkin's The Exorcist was released on an unsuspecting public. Overnight, it changed the face of horror. The public wanted more, and a slew of possession Satanism movies followed. Alberto De Martino's Antichrist, Beyond the Door, and Richard Donner's The Omen, to name a few. Witchcraft had to take a back seat for a while. Virgin Witch, Mark of the Devil 2 and Inquisition all appeared on the scene with little to no fanfare, and to be honest, they were more in line with the witchploitation boom of the first few years of the decade. It wasn't until 1977 that a masterpiece of Italian cinema put the witch back on the big screen in style. Dario Argento's Suspiria, the first in a trilogy of films about the three mothers, was loosely based on Thomas de Quincey's Lavana and Our Ladies of Sorrow, and a story given to Argento by his muse Daria Nicolodi, whose grandmother, the pianist Yvonne Muller-Loeb Casea, attended a finishing school on the Germany-Austria border, where the faculty were believed to practice witchcraft. Argento's three mothers, Mater Lacrimarum, the mother of tears, Mater Suspiriorum, the mother of sighs, and Mater Tenebrarum, the mother of darkness, were each built a dwelling, one in Rome, one in Freiburg, and one in New York. And from these dwellings they would rule the world through tears, sorrow, and darkness. Argento's witches are portrayed as malefic. In Suspiria, the witchcraft expert, Professor Emilius, tells the protagonist Susie Bannion that while the witches are powerful, they are only capable of harm. He also points out to her that a coven is like a serpent and removing the head will render it harmless. This is a very negative interpretation of the witch, and by the time we reach the third instalment, Mother of Tears, the witches have become perverse cannibalistic entities, more monstrous than human. Someone that has not been discussed as yet is Kenneth Anger. Anger started out in the 1940s making short avant-garde films, and in 1954 he directed the inauguration of the Pleasure Dome, a 38-minute film with Crowleyan and Thelemite themes. The influence of Crowley continued throughout Anger's career. His planned 1960s masterwork was to be Lucifer Rising, a film about the emerging age of Horus. After choosing Bobby Beausoleil for the part of Lucifer, the pair fell out. Anger accused of him stealing the footage he'd shot for the film, and rumour has it that Beausoleil passed the footage to Charles Manson, who held it hostage, expecting Anger to pay. Instead, Anger took what footage he had left and teamed up with Mick Jagger, who recorded the soundtrack and released what became Invocation of My Demon Brother in 1969. Despite everything that had happened and all the problems he'd had, Anger still wasn't finished with Lucifer Rising and began working again on the project. This time with Miriam Gibril as Isis, Donald Cammell as Osiris, Marianne Faithfull as Lilith, and Leslie Huggins as Lucifer. Initially, Anger had persuaded his friend Jimmy Page to record the soundtrack, but the score was dumped after the pair had a very public falling out when Page's wife kicked Anger out of their home. Anger went on to reconcile with Beausoleil, who recorded a replacement soundtrack from his prison cell. It was 1981 before Lucifer Rising was finally completed, 15 years after Anger had first begun the project, and 10 years after he started working on the film for a second time. The late 70s and early 80s were otherwise generally a quiet time for the witch. However, there were a few children's TV series worthy of mention. Fenella the Kettle Witch from Chorlton and the Wheelies, Evil Edna from Will-o'-the-Wisp, and Grotbags from Emu's World and the Pink Windmill. In each instance, the witch is portrayed as a caricature of the stereotypical evil witch that can be seen in any number of children's books. All three are ugly, bad-tempered, and hark back to the image of the Wicked Witch of the West. Also worthy of mention from this time is the 1983 series The Witches and the Grinnygog, in which a strange statue, the Grinnygog, turns out to be some sort of familiar spirit, enters the possession of a contemporary family. Meanwhile, three medieval witches who've evaded a witch hunt by time-slipping to the modern era search for one of their daughters, who was separated from her mother during the witch burning. A group of children piece the whole story together and realise that their town must make amends for the witch burnings. This is really interesting as it symbolises the first time on screen an attempt is made to make amends for the witch trials. The 1980s were largely dominated by zombies and American slasher movies, and witchcraft was largely ignored, partly down to the satanic panic that originated in the US, before becoming a worldwide problem. Allegations of a network of satanic abusers turned out to be unfounded, but left little interest in witchcraft. One of the few interesting exceptions during the early 1980s was the 1981 film Evil Speak. Ron Howard's younger brother Clint stars as Stanley Coopersmith, a student at a US military academy who was mercilessly bullied by his peers. He accidentally uncovers the magical grimoire of a Father Esteban, the leader of a medieval satanic sect. Coopersmith discovers a ritual that will allow Esteban to return from the grave, and once completed, it will see all kinds of hell unleashed upon the academy. What is so interesting about Evil Speak is its use of modern technology in performing ritual magic. Coopersmith steals a computer from the school to assist him with the performance of the ritual. This kind of preempts the internet revolution by several years. The computer has become a key tool in modern witchcraft. We now have access to online blogs, social media sites at the tip of our fingers that can provide the modern practitioner with a wealth of information and a ready-made community to join. The online witchcraft community ensures the dissemination of information is farther reaching than ever before, and many organisations like the Pagan Federation and the Children of Artemis have thriving online communities. What was once arcane is now readily available to a modern audience at the push of a button. The most successful witchcraft movies of the 1980s was the big screen adaptation of John Updike's novel The Witches of Eastwick. The film took a trio of strong A-list actresses, Cher, Susan Sarandon and Michelle Pfeiffer, and pitted them against Jack Nicholson's Daryl Van Horn. Sadly, the results were disappointing. The witchcraft and female empowerment of the novel were shunted to one side in favour of a story that focuses more on the sexual relationships of the protagonists. However, it signalled a return to mainstream cinema for the witch. At the close of the 1980s, Alan Parker's Angel Heart brought voodoo to the fore. Angel Heart was a hard-boiled detective film with Mickey Rourke as the detective Harry Angel, hired by Robert De Niro as Louis Cypher to track down an old bluesman called John Reed Favourite. The film provides Lisa Bonet with a platform on which to really shine as the voodoo priestess Epiphany Proudfoot in some fabulous scenes of ritual sacrifice. Voodoo is also at the heart of Wes Craven's Serpent and the Rainbow, which followed hot on the heels of Angel Heart in 1988. It was interesting to see voodoo feature in mainstream cinema for the first time, having featured in nothing but exploitation films since the days of I Walked with a Zombie and White Zombie. The 1990s kicked off with a couple of dark kids' tales. Roald Dahl's The Witches, starring Angelica Houston, from 1990, and 1993's Hocus Pocus, starring Bette Midler, which both provided some light entertainment for younger children. However, the 1990s turned out to be the period of the teen screen witch, and in fact the year of 1996 in particular saw a host of iconic films and TV witches make their debuts. The first one we're going to look at is everyone's favourite vampire slayer Buffy. Loosely based on the vampire hunting film from 1992 starring Christy Swanson, Buffy resurfaced on TV with a new actress in the lead role, Sarah Michelle Gellar. Whilst vampire hunters aren't really of interest to us, Buffy's best friend Willow Rosenberg, played by Alison Hannigan, certainly is. Willow starts out as a shy young girl whose confidence begins to grow as she learns more and more about the craft, eventually blossoming into a very powerful witch. Willow also becomes the first openly gay screen witch when she meets her lover Tara. Jane magazine described their relationship as an audacious portrayal because gay lovers had never been depicted on screen doing the normal, everyday things we all do, like holding hands, cooking together, or even dancing. In the same year, another important screen depiction of the teen witch comes from the film The Craft, the first film to portray angsty, post-grunge teen witches. Nancy Downs, played by Fairuza Balk, and the three friends decide to found a coven in order to deal with the difficulties of teenage life. After failing to heed the sage advice offered to them by the owner of the local occult emporium, they end up in a world of trouble that they must fix themselves. The magical workings in the craft needed special attention in order that they felt believable to teens and did not offend Wiccans. High Priestess Pat Devin was employed as a consultant on the film, ensuring that whilst they weren't using real rituals, they at least represented something that had a loose basis in reality. All of the girls had been through tough times and were looking for empowerment. They suffered from a variety of maladies, including poverty, physical abuse, bullying, body confidence issues, and suicidal thoughts. They used the craft to take control of their lives and grow in strength and confidence. Whilst things ultimately go wrong, most of the girls learn from their experiences and come out of it with a better understanding of their powers. Whilst the film has a positive message about being yourself and harming no one, it is also worth mentioning that Pam Grossman feels the film reflects negatively on teenage girls, suggesting they lack self-confidence, control, and unleashing their full potential is to invite mayhem and destruction. She goes on to say that girls only join forces as an act of necessity and not kinship. Like anything in life, witchcraft can be used to enrich the lives of its practitioners if used responsibly. For me, that should be the overriding message we draw from the craft. Sabrina the Teenage Witch is quite different. A gentle and slightly goofy Disney-style sitcom for kids, loosely based around the Archie comic of the same name. Sabrina Spellman, played by Melissa Joan Hart, discovers on her 16th birthday that she has magical powers that she must learn to control. Sabrina lives with her aunts Zelda and Hilda, a pair of witches tasked with educating their niece in the ways of the craft. Sabrina provides some fairly powerful images of female role models. Her aunts provide Sabrina with a settled home life, a family, and her magical education. The added backstory about her life ensures that Sabrina comes across as a fairly normal teenager, with the same concerns as any non-magical teens. Relationships, shopping, popularity and grades. Proof that witches really aren't that different to anyone else. We will discuss Miss Spellman later. 1996 was also the year when Hollywood decided to adapt Arthur Miller's The Crucible for cinema audiences. Written in 1953 as an allegory for McCarthyism in the United States, when the US government elected to persecute individuals accused of being communist. The Crucible tells the story, albeit with some artistic license, of the Salem witch trials of 1692. The film stars Winona Ryder, Daniel Day-Lewis and Peter Vaughan, and proved to be a high-profile return to cinema screens for The Witch, leading to further forays into the magical sphere. 2 short years later, in 1998's Practical Magic thrust witchcraft and magic back once again into the mainstream. The film leans heavily on its 2 main characters, the Owens sisters, Gillian and Sally, played respectively by Nicole Kidman and Sandra Bullock. The Owens family are cursed. Any man who falls in love with an Owens woman is destined to die, leaving her alone. The film raises important issues about physical abuse and the mental strength of women who have suffered from it. Gillian is attacked by her lover Jimmy, who is in turn killed by Sally. Jimmy returns to haunt Gillian as a ghost, eventually attempting to take over her body. Sally, through the use of blood magic, prevents him from doing so. Sally's strength in dealing with Jimmy is what gets Gillian through, and by the end of the film, all of the town's women are behind them, forming a formidable field of collective energy on which to draw. Practical Magic has a strong feminist message, and by the end of the story, the women have formed a unique bond that ensures they're stronger than their individual selves. 2 years later, in 2000, Joanne Harris' novel, Chocolat, was filmed and released in cinemas. Vianne Rocher, played by Juliette Binoche, takes up residence in a small provincial French town with her daughter Anouk. In a move that references Mary Poppins, they arrive on a very windy day, and immediately go about setting up a chocolaterie during the festival of Lent, traditionally a time of abstinence in the Christian calendar. Vianne is a wild spirit, and her brand of magic comes in the form of chocolate. She's determined to use her witchy ways to heal the town's ills. She immediately falls foul of Renaud, Alfred Molina, the town's stuffy, overly officious and deeply religious mayor, who is battling his own demons as well as the loss of his wife, who has walked out on him. Vianne is different to most of the other witches discussed in this talk. She's potentially even more inspirational than those we've already met. A strong woman standing in the face of officialdom. She's caring, believable, and possesses a steely determination to battle Renaud for the hearts and minds of the townsfolk. She does need a little help at times from Anouk and the others around her, who she's helped before she understands what she must do to ensure her own happiness. Series like Buffy and Sabrina seem to open the floodgates for more occult-flavoured teen TV. Charmed, The Vampire Diaries, Salem, The Originals, Supernatural, The Witches of East End, and The Discovery of Witches have all taken a stab at repeating the achievements of Buffy, with various levels of success. In American Horror Story Coven, Fleetwood Mac legend Stevie Nicks is exposed as a powerful witch, thus tying the image of the witch to successful and influential women within the sphere of popular culture. The culmination of something subversive that started with Bewitched and the Addams Family over 50 years ago. The Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry is the next step on our journey, and while you could write an entire talk on J.K. Rowling's universe, I'll try to keep this brief. One of the key factors for me is the equal footing assigned to both the male and female practitioners of the art of magic. Despite having different titles, witch and wizard, they learn the same things and are treated in the same way. And whilst Harry's name is on the title of both the films and the books, the most interesting character is Hermione. Grossman called her a crusader for goodness who is never corrupted by power and never over-sexualized. She's certainly a hard-working, intelligent and loyal figure with a strong moral compass who uses her talents as a witch for the benevolence of others. A very strong, positive role model. In the last few years there has once again been a rise of interest in the witch. Films and TV series like The Disappointing Blair Witch 2016, Robert Eggers' The Witch from 2015 and The Chilling Adventures of Sabrina have spearheaded this latest revival of interest. I suspect the fact that mankind is hell-bent on pressing the self-destruct button isn't harming interest in alternative forms of spirituality either, as people attempt to make sense of all the craziness that's currently taking place. The Witch in particular is interesting, as I feel it follows the well-trodden path of titles like Witchfinder General, Haxan and Witchhammer, in that it draws heavily on actual 17th century witchcraft accounts in order to create something that has a certain realistic feel to it. There could be a number of different explanations given for the film's climax. Was Thomason suffering from ergot poisoning, which can attack the nervous system, potentially causing psychosis or hallucinations? Did the isolation or starvation experienced by the family lead to mental health issues? Or were there really witches lurking in the forest? Did Black Phillip really want Thomason to live deliciously? Or was she just imagining things because she was poisoned, hungry, or struggling with her mental health? We may never know, but I quite like the fact that it's left open to interpretation. A year later, Anna Biller's The Love Witch from 2016, a horror comedy that pays tribute to the horror and exploitation films of Russ Meyer and Herschel Gordon Lewis, was released. After the death of her husband, Elaine, played by Samantha Robinson, ups sticks and moves to California. Once ensconced in her new surroundings, she sets about snaring herself a new lover, using the magical craft to lure men in, and then using it to get rid of them permanently, once they've served their purpose. Elena Lazic wrote that movies are often suspicious of strong, beautiful women, framing them not as real people with agency or desires of their own, but as objects to be looked at. She goes on to suggest that a beautiful woman without makeup is considered pure, inoffensive and unaware of her power, whereas a stylish, beautiful woman is considered to be a femme fatale, using man's weaknesses to her advantage. Elaine revels in the second category, using both her magical skills and her feminine wiles to seduce and control men, before casting them aside when they want more than she's willing to give them. The final series we'll be looking at today is Netflix's Chilling Adventures of Sabrina, a reimagining of Sabrina the Teenage Witch for the next generation, featuring an altogether darker, more complex and more grown-up version of Sabrina Spellman. Whilst the series links the witches to Satanism and the dark side, Sabrina herself is half mortal, half witch, representing the delicate balance between the worlds of humans and witches. She does not want to do the bidding of the Dark Lord and stands up to him at every opportunity, thus showing her strength of character. Sabrina is also surrounded by a host of strong female characters: her aunts Zelda and Hilda, her friends Roz and Susie, and the weird sisters Prudence, Dorcas and Agatha. These powerful women support Sabrina in doing things her way, and in a refreshing role reversal they can often be seen protecting the male characters. In fact, the chilling adventures of Sabrina has managed to subvert gender roles even further. In the second season, Susie decides that she no longer wishes to be identified as a female, preferring to be known as a male, Theo. The actor Lachlan Watson is non-binary and was heavily involved in the creation of the character, thus giving him a realistic personality. Much like in the 1996 version, Sabrina has the ability to reconcile her dual identities as a witch and a high school student. She refuses to give up her high school life in order to attend the Academy of Unseen Arts, opting instead to share her time between the two schools. She also denies her birthright as a satanic witch by refusing to sign the Book of the Beast, a sure sign she's doing things her way. This seems like a good point at which to end our discussion. This whistle-stop history of the witch in cinema is merely the tip of the iceberg. There are a number of films we didn't have time to discuss, and many of those discussed I would have loved to talk about in greater depth, but time constraints mean I can't go on boring you all forever. All that leaves for me to say is that the witch remains an important figure in screen culture. Even our old friend Mary Poppins returned in 2018 to show that even the big studios like Disney love a good, strong, witchy character. As you can see, there have been a lot of positive changes since the birth of cinema at the end of the 19th century, and while we still have some way to go before witches and pagans become accepted as normal by everyone, and parity is achieved between men and women, we are much closer than ever before. Thank you.